I'm Dana J. Francois, and you're listening to Stirring the Plot. Whether you're gay, hot, or doing it for the plot, this is the podcast for you. We're here and we're queer, we're gay, and we slay. And welcome back. Today's episode is for the avoidant girls, gays, and theys, the emotionally repressed, the I'll text them later squad who never text back, and the one who swears they're healed until a single miscommunication has them spiraling into a 3-week internal monologue. I'm joined by someone who understands this intimately, Winter.
Hey, young Woody with the AO.
What up, Winter? Welcome back to the pod.
It's been a minute.
Winter has joined me on this little podcast journey and has launched their own podcast.
Hey, mask off.
Period.
Give it a listen.
Yeah,
Take that mask off.
All streaming platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been following along for the past few weeks, and you're really doing the damn thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm proud of you.
And shout out to you. I mean, just literally almost a year ago, I was telling Dana I wanted to do a podcast, and I was always nervous. And she was the one that actually inspired me to be like, just go for it. Like, who cares? So,
oh yeah.
Shout out to you on that.
Thank you. And you've been doing an amazing job. So keep going. I'm excited. So yeah, make sure you guys check out Winter's pod. I'm gonna have everything linked in the show notes, of course. But yeah, Winter, I'm glad you're joining me today. I have to say, guys, Winter is honestly one of the most thoughtful, grounded, and just beautifully complex people that I know. And I think today's podcast episode is gonna be really, really interesting because today we are unpacking the way that culture, religion, gender identity, and childhood can shape how we show up in our adult relationships. So romantic, platonic, familial, no connection is safe from our deep dive. And yes, we're gonna be talking about communication, or rather lack thereof. So let's get into it. All right, Winter, I want to start here. Being trans-masked and growing up in a religious or culturally specific environment, during your journey, your point of view, your experience, how did that shape your sense of self early on? What did the beginning of your journey through identity look like through the lens of culture and religion and just yourself?
Yeah, I mean, also in the intro, I do want to point out, you forgot to call me handsome, so I'm just a little offended that wasn't one of the descriptions.
Oh yeah,
so.
Sexy, hot as fuck, handsome, beautiful.
I'm blushing. Thank you.
Keep blushing. Literally, I can see it from here.
I'm getting red. Yeah, I'm getting red. So I feel honored that she even did that. So. But to answer your question, I think as far as the religious aspect, I even talk about this in my first episode of Mask Off, Unmasking Winter. I did grow up in a very Christian household where we went to church, as kids every Sunday. We grew up on VeggieTales. We went to youth group. Any sort of church experience that a kid can have.
Yeah.
My mom was very much adamant about us doing that. She always wanted us to be plugged into the church.
Yeah.
And going to Bible camps, and I even went to a purity class. I actually used to think those are cool. The Jonas Brothers.
Honestly, right? Nick with his purity ring. I was like, period, okay.
There you go. Yeah.
That's what happens. PK. If you guys know, that's Pastor's kid. I definitely have that experience, and we got that RT, that religious trauma. So.
That's what we're gonna be bonding over. And yeah, so it was quite evident that the Bible was a big thing in our household. My parents saw that as the absolute truth. That's something that should be your guiding force. And while I did agree with certain aspects of the Bible, like loving your neighbor and loving people, there's obviously the obvious area where I felt as a kid it was the worst thing to be gay.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what was communicated to us
so early on,
yeah. Which I didn't even know what that was. I was I knew I liked girls, but I didn't know what is gay, what is queerness. That never really crossed my mind. And so I felt conflicted, because I think as much as I was I love Jesus and all of that, and I truthfully I still do, but I feel when I was a kid I had a lot of confusion over the Bible and Christianity, because I couldn't understand if people are saying God makes no mistakes. I sometimes felt like I was one, in terms of why was I born biologically a female as opposed to a boy? Because that's how I always felt. I always felt like I was a boy. People, and culturally, I think at that time, the early 2000s, trans. I mean, it's not like the 1950s, obviously.
Yeah.
There was some space for queerness, but very little.
Yeah.
And so at that time, if you were like what everyone saw as a girl, it was frowned upon if you said, oh, I have a crush on, Stacy. They're like, well, you can't like Stacy, you're a girl. And so that was always quite strange to me, because I was like, why can't I like her? And it made me feel kind of embarrassed, like, oh, but that's who I actually like. Like, I didn't like Zach. So I remember just like culturally, like that was kind of the theme. And I think also with my family being Latino, they were very much, you had to marry, like if you're biologically a woman, you would marry a man. And, I always felt confused by that, because I never saw myself marrying men at all. I just was never interested in them. So
Of course.
I always just felt like, oh, like that's weird. Why do I have to marry a guy? That's super strange.
Yeah.
But I think what helped me a lot culturally, or even just my upbringing, was my mom was very accepting of me being a tomboy. So I wore a lot of boys' clothing. I felt like I was a boy. I always valued that my mom allowed me to dress the way I wanted to, because as a kid I felt very comfortable and confident with myself.
Yeah, that's good.
Because I dressed that way. But then other family members would judge my mom for allowing me to dress like a boy. They would literally say, why are you letting your kid dress like that? They're gonna turn gay. Again, like that was the worst thing to be. And so because I saw ripples of that, I was confused. But I did value that my mom didn't force me to wear like skirts or dresses like other tomboys that I would see that were in my class.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, I had that comfort of like I could be myself, but that did start to change once I started to become a teenager.
Oh, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's crazy that you say that, because I think when you grow up, you're in these spaces and you have these certain expectations that you even put on yourself, just learned behavior and learned expectations that become rooted as fact in your mind. And so when you grow up in these spaces with that mindset, you learn very early on how to shrink yourself.
Right.
And I think you learn how to almost talk in like code, like you're speaking in code, and you're learning early on how to stay palatable. And then one day you wake up and you're 25 or you're 28, you're 30, and you realize, holy shit, I've been ghosting my own identity.
Yeah.
You're
gaslighting yourself.
Gaslighting yourself. Like I have no idea who I really am, because you never allowed yourself the freedom to get to know yourself. You never held space for yourself type of shit.
Right.
And so it's crazy to realize, yeah, I've been ghosting my own identity. So my question to you is, what part of yourself did you feel like you had to hide? And what did liberation look like, even if it ever fully has?
So the parts that I hid a lot were my queerness. I did experience a lot of internalized homophobia just because I was constantly told like being gay was wrong. Like that's outside of like what God made. And so there was a lot of shame in that. And I think also the trans aspect of myself.
Absolutely.
So even when I say come out, but I didn't, and I always make this joke, like when I had the mid fade, like I didn't have to come out, like it just showed, you know, that I was quite,
like I'm here.
I'm here and I'm queer. But I felt like when I was first being more comfortable with being queer, I still couldn't relate initially to being a lesbian. I was like, that word doesn't sit well with like how I see myself.
Yeah.
So during the early stages of me being more like queer presenting, I did date a lot of lesbians. And at that time, even just a few years ago, I think people forget like transgender, that was still very foreign, even like 3 years ago, you know? And so at that time, I felt disconnected with being a lesbian, but I was like, I know I like girls, but I don't feel fully connected with my body and how they perceive me. Like, I don't like that they see me as a woman. But when I would say that, like, I remember the first time I told this girl that I was seeing that I see myself as a guy. She didn't know what to say. She just was like, well, I see you as a girl. And that was like I'm trying to be honest with you, but like I feel like you're shutting me down.
Yeah.
And so I just felt like it's something wrong with me, like what people don't understand. And most people, I mean, there was very little representation of transness. So yes, I was able to be queer, but not in an authentic way that I fully felt myself.
Yeah.
so when I got shut down in that moment, I was just like, oh, I'm a weirdo, so I'm not gonna like ever say that again. But then it just got to the point where I just couldn't continue pretending to be something I wasn't. And I was like, well, if that person genuinely cares about me, they would be accepting. And if they don't, well, bye. I'm not gonna waste my time with
100%.
being shut down like that. So to answer that second part of your question, the liberation, I really do think cutting my hair was that first taste of liberation, because for me, my hair was like the part of me that felt most feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And I had very long hair a few years ago, which is, it's kind of crazy. I always tucked it in a beanie, or like tucked it in on like a snapback or something like that. But I think when I first cut my hair, it was that taste of like, oh, I don't have to do what everybody wants me to do. Like, I can be myself. And yes, it's scary, but it did feel very freeing. And so I think that moment is a huge milestone in pushing me to be more accepting of myself. So that, I think that's when I first experienced that liberation.
Honestly, and just to kind of go from there, because you kind of hit the nail beautifully on the head, I think growing up a certain way and you finally reaching that point of liberation, but it takes time to kind of navigate your way through that, and your different environments, your sense of self, your culture, your religion, everything plays a role. So for you specifically, experiencing all of these different intersections definitely can shape how you show up, specifically like in love or in romantic relationships, like hyper independence, shutdowns, emotional hiding places, all of that. And I guess I'll admit, like I also am raising my hand, you know, like I do that too. So I think it's perfect to, my goal here on the pod is to hold space for these conversations. And I think that we can address avoidant tendencies. We can talk about the instinct, that initial or response, more so, to just disappear inside yourself instead of express, you know? And so when you're talking about cutting your hair and getting that freedom and that liberation, but you've went through all of this and you're still carrying these almost habits of like distancing and hiding. So it can affect how you show up in your adult relationships and show up in love. And so my question to you is, when did you realize that avoidance was like almost your default setting?
That's a good question. I think I noticed that when it came to multiple things. I think on one hand, because I didn't open up, it hurt people. And I think, and we've talked about this, where then if you don't give them that clarity, they start assuming, oh, Winter just doesn't care, or, you know, I don't mean anything to them because they're never going to say, you know, how they truly feel. And, you know, it doesn't give me the opportunity to prove them otherwise, because I'm just like, oh, well, whatever, they were going to leave anyway, so I don't need to clarify. Truthfully, I think also starting the podcast of Mask Off, where I notice that for some time I have a hard time, even right now, like I almost want to interview you, Dana, to tell you the truth. Like
cope, like,
I know, like
instinctual.
Like I was literally gonna do that right now, to tell you the truth. I was like, okay, but what about you? Like I was you do that because it's safer, because you're like, oh I'm letting someone in, but you know. But I think honestly, having a podcast like Mask Off, I do want to walk the walk. I don't want to just be like, all right guys, take that mask off, and I'm over here sealing that mask on tighter than a mofo, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So that was also realization. So on one hand, to answer your question, in some of the relationships I've had, that was like feedback I always received, like, you are shutting down, you're not letting me in. And they didn't feel validated because I didn't share, because you have to, I think in any sort of relationship, you have to give something. You have to give some sense of vulnerability for it to strengthen. Otherwise, it's going to be a surface level relationship, and that's never going to fulfill you. I mean, would you agree on that? Or?
I 100% agree, because if you're not willing to be vulnerable, the other person's not going to feel safe, like, to match you there, you know?
Right.
And so it's scary, and it's so difficult. I'm speaking for myself and my own experience. It's so hard to do that. But I pride myself on being a soft place to land for people. That is my goal. I want to be a safe space for those that I care about. But I know, like you said, I have to walk the walk to build that connection, and I have to lead by example. And in order to build the bridge between us, I need to show up in that same softness, and I need to extend that vulnerability. I need to match you there, because that just will continue to make you feel safer. If you want want someone to feel safe with you, then you got to match that energy, you know? I agree with you. You got to walk the walk and you got to match them there. And that you have to really try to unlearn that avoidance. And it's crazy because I think that we just live in this society where we normalize it, you know?
Yeah.
And genuinely, like, we often bond over it. That is, you know, something that just has become normalized in our generations, I think, making light of these almost like emotional, like, or like being stunted in emotional intimacy almost. Making light of it by being like, haha, I'm emotionally repressed too. Like, you know, like, no, like, be vulnerable and be real. And it's hard to face yourself.
It really
you know?
is.
Yeah, it's so difficult. And I think underneath all of it, it's the fear of being truly known. And that's why I love your podcast, because it's mask off and it's really showing up and really trying to reveal your most authentic self, but like to you personally see yourself. And that's the hardest part.
Right.
So I want to ask you, from your journey in navigating this, your point of view, and especially to all of that I just mentioned, but you also have this added layer of, you know, your trans experience. And, you know, sometimes it can commonly be under a microscope almost, or even like fetishized, or just really like almost like that's a niche like interest. I think I can relate in the way of like being a femme Black woman. Like, people have this weird fetishization of like, you know, Black women. So how has your journey been like in regards to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I feel like it's been interesting because I think I tend to date girls that are either bisexual or pansexual. I think there's that sense of comfort with that specific type of girl because they tend to, I mean, they've kind of experienced everything. They're open to everything. You don't feel like you have to like over explain things as much as like in other relationships. At least that's been my experience. Can't speak on anyone else's. Yeah, it's interesting because I think when I was initially on the dating apps, you would get all types. I mean, like anyone, you get all types of weird connections. And I think there was definitely this interest in being someone's like third party on even in straight relationships, which I was always confused about because I didn't like that objectification that they just saw me as like something to conquer. I don't know. And I think sometimes I do question those intentions. But if I'm also being honest, I think sometimes there is, when I am intimate with someone, there is a little bit of like, especially being trans, you're like, am I going to be like, especially during early stages, am I man enough for this person? Like, they're used to being with a man. Like, I sometimes get in my head like, oh, like, is it going to be that different with me or what? And that happened a lot during like the early stages of a little bit of that insecurity, truthfully, when I first was like being intimate with people.
Absolutely. And all of those play a role in how you show up in these romantic relationships, for sure. When you're dating specifically, like you mentioned, I think going back, it kind of walks hand in hand with those avoidant tendencies, because maybe it's easier to slip into that because, like you mentioned, like being vulnerable and saying, am I man enough for these relationships, or can they see me as the way I want them to see me? Because you can't control other people's perspective of yourself.
Right.
It's just, I'm showing up as I am, take me as I am type of thing. But there's that fear there to go there and really allow yourself to go there. And I think that that's where that kind of, you know, distancing, avoidance, self-sabotage, all of that comes into play, mainly out of fear of being truly seen for who you are, and the fear of like, am I gonna be enough, you know?
Right.
So I guess my question to you is basically showing up in romantic relationships that way, but also it can bleed into your other relationships too, family and friendships, and the fear of being perceived in general. How do you think all of that shapes the way that you relate to those relationships, romantic, friendship, family, and not just how you show up, but how they show up as well?
I think as far as like romantic, I think for many years, to your point, that avoidant tendency, I think it was easier to be infatuated with people and just leave it as like, truthfully, superficial. Like, I'm attracted to this person physically, and that's kind of that. But in that comes the reality of like, wait, but this person isn't good for me, right?
100%.
But you're like, it's easier to deal with more of like a superficial relationship because they're not going to ask much of you to be vulnerable, to be honest with those insecurities that you have, right? But I think now as I gotten older, it's definitely changed my perspective on romantic relationships. For me, I didn't grow up with like great examples of relationships, and oftentimes I saw the opposite. When you were vulnerable, like there was pain attached to that. But honestly, like I have a twin sister, as you know, Dana. She's married to one of the most amazing guys I've ever met in my life. You know, I don't always rave about straight guys, but this guy, he's it. Like they're both just such a beautiful couple, and they've showed me what a healthy relationship can be, and that has inspired me to not want to settle for anything less, because I've seen it exist. When I was younger, I didn't see that, so I just was like, all right, whatever, I'll have fun, I'll like someone just for the attraction, and whatever, if it ends, it ends. But at least they didn't ask much for me. But then it feels like fast food. Like I think seeing an example of like a really healthy relationship has inspired me to do that, and I think seeing them be so vulnerable with each other in a very accepting way made me want to do that too, where I'm not masking and presenting myself as like I have everything, perfect, because I don't, As far as family dynamics, I feel like having my twin sister has helped me tremendously in terms of like feeling that acceptance, because she has always been there for me, and I just want to be that same way to myself. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does.
But yeah, I think she like really inspires me a lot. And then as far as friends, right?
Yeah.
As far as me showing up for friends, so because as Dana and I mentioned, we're both very avoidant. When you have a negative and a negative, what are we going to get?
Exactly.
So we're not going to get clarity. And I think that did kind of affect our friendship for some time, where I didn't realize I was giving you nothing. Normally, I do have this sort of avoidant, even with my friendships, where I'm like, oh, if they didn't reach out, then that means they don't want to hang out. Like, that's okay. I could see them in 6 months, So I think through our discussions that we've had,
absolutely,
you showed me of, okay, how can I also meet you? Because like what you were saying earlier, like you also have to be vulnerable with that person. And I didn't realize how much it was affecting our friendship, that I wasn't really giving you much besides what's up, Dana, or so yeah, I don't know. Did you want to?
No, and I agree. And in going off of a few things that you said, I think sometimes, especially whenever you have an avoidant and you have a misalignment, and you can very easily slip back into your default setting. Me speaking from my own experience, I would say that growing up, seeing for so long, I never had a very good representation of what that looked like. Right. And so I learned all of these different reactive coping mechanisms and built an avoidant from the ground up, and trying to unlearn that in my adulthood is fucking hard, and you relapse and all that kind of stuff. And for so long, I just walked through situations with, friendships even, where my default setting was silence, was almost like power, which is like, ew, Yeah. But now I'm in this point in my life where I have these relationships that are so beautiful and healthy that I'm like, why am I in this default setting? I need to show up for them the way that they show up for me. So I agree with you. Like, we have to meet each other where we are, and you have to come as you are and say, this is me, and this is what I can bring to the table. What can you bring to the table, and where can we meet each other, and what can we build from here together, to be better. But yeah, this has given me a lot to reflect on and to take away. And I guess my final question to you would just be like, what would you say to someone who's sort of navigating their own journey? They're in this in-between place, navigating faith or family or friends, gender identity, all of that. What would you say to them?
It takes time. And I think oftentimes, especially with us living in an instant gratification culture,
that part,
we think it has to be immediate. And just because we don't see it right away doesn't mean it's not happening. I am very grateful for even the lowest of times, because it did teach me and push me to get out of my comfort zone, to also be open to sharing that brokenness that I used to hide a lot, because that's actually how I've had stronger connections with people. Not me showing the cool, composed Winter, but showing the very vulnerable Winter. And
I just had one last question too.
Yeah.
Was, I guess, to the friends out there, what does it take to truly see someone and not just project your fears onto them?
Kind of what you were saying, like giving space to listen to the other person, because you never know. So, and I really do think people will show you how they feel if you give them that space without judgment, because you don't know what that person's thinking.
I just want to say, if you take anything from today's episode, let it be this. Your communication style is not who you are. It's not your character. It is a learned language, and you can unlearn it. So you can choose to respond, not to retreat. You can choose to open your mouth instead of go ghost. And you can choose to heal the parts of yourself that were taught silence was safer than, selfhood. So, Winter, I want to thank you for coming on the pod, for naming things that we are still unlearning, for things that we are discovering. Again, check out their podcast, because that's really what it's all about, is unmasking. Winter, where else can we find you on social media?
You could find me on Winter Rosé. That's ROSAY. You can stream Mask Off on all major streaming platforms, and you can also find the Mask Off pod on Instagram as well.
Period. And I will have everything linked in the show notes as well. But yeah, to everyone listening, I just want to say, be loud with your healing. Speak up before it festers, and remember that you're not too much. You just weren't heard clearly before. So as always, take what resonates, leave the rest. But for now, we're going to wrap up this episode. If you're enjoying my podcast, don't forget to rate it 5 stars, because it not only lets me know that you enjoy listening, but it also helps my podcast get boosted so that it can reach a wider audience. Follow at Stirring the Plod Pod on all social media platforms to stay up to date and never miss an episode. If you'd like to connect with me, I'm just at Dana J. Francois on all social media platforms. I will have everything linked in the show notes. And with that being said, thank you for listening. Make sure that you subscribe to my podcast and tune in weekly, because I'm gay, I'm hot, and if there's one thing about me, I'm gonna stir the plot.